Okay, good afternoon. It is now noon, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Obviously, today we are going to be talking a little bit about the judicial branch, which you started last week. A reminder that you had an assignment over the judicial branch, which many of you have not turned in yet. Those have been entered in as missing as of today. Some of you did turn it in this morning. I will rectify that later on today, but grades have been updated, and there is an issue with grades, folks. We are only a few weeks away from the end of the quarter, believe it or not. So we're going to want to get those assignments made up ASAP. I know that some of you have kind of fallen behind a little bit. Certainly some of you are much lower than the percentages you typically have. So let's make sure that we're at least attempting to get back on it, and trying to get our grades to where they are passing for the quarter, because we don't want to start off the second semester with a failing mark. So please reach out if you're having issues, or any sort of questions over the assignments that have been put out there so far. Mr. Ficker posted a couple more assignments, which we'll go over here in a second. But first, I need to go over the Supreme Court. There is an assignment that I posted this morning in regards to this class session on Zoom. It's a question that requires just a brief answer, about 2 to 3 sentences. So I would strongly advise you to have that up and ready to go. And that way, when I'm done talking, you can immediately answer the question at the end, before you move on to your 6th bell class. And I'll try and give you time at the end with which to accomplish that. To start off, though, I am going to share my screen. And like I said, we are talking about the Supreme Court today. So the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court matters here because, again, it is the highest court in the land. It is a lifetime appointment, which is the subject matter of the question I'm asking today is, should it be a lifetime appointment? And we're going to kind of get to why that is controversial here in a second. But according to Article 3 of the Constitution, that sets up the judicial branch, it basically spells out the framework of the Supreme Court, that it is a lifetime appointment, that as soon as somebody is nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, they are to serve for life or until they decide to drop out, until they decide to retire. So they do have that option as well. But if you don't want to retire, you're there for life unless you get impeached and thrown out, which can happen to a judge. It can happen to any high level government official. Okay. So basically, the Supreme Court, very controversially, is a lifetime appointment, and we'll kind of get to why, again, that's somewhat applicable here to our modern day issues with the Supreme Court here in a second. But the most important thing is that you understand that the Supreme Court is made up of people. And the people we're talking about here are these 9 justices right here. 9 justices on the Supreme Court, again, serve for life. This is actually one of the most diverse groups we've ever had on the Supreme Court. You go back just 50 years and you're looking at 9 white men on the Supreme Court. So we've just now started to get our first real diversity on the Supreme Court, just in the past half century or so. And so this is what is widely considered to be a very diverse Supreme Court. Even though there's still 5 old white men on the court, there are minorities, there are females. And what is more important, at least in the Supreme Court, is the ideology and the diversity of ideology. That's what they're really looking for, is the difference between conservative and liberal. And if you remember from the very beginning of the year, we had a class session where we talked about the difference between a conservative, which is right-leaning and typically represented by the Republican Party in United States governance, and the liberal side, which is left-leaning and typically represented by the Democrats. So we do have kind of a mixture, and we're going to talk about why that matters here in a second. Now, the current Supreme Court is under the guidance and leadership of Chief Justice John Roberts. Now, Chief Justice means you are in charge of the Supreme Court, and you are currently looking at one of the youngest Supreme Court Chief Justices we've ever had, which means he could be the longest serving when he finally retires or dies. It depends on how long he chooses to stay on or how long he is healthy enough to continue. So John Roberts took over the court when he was 50 years old. exceptionally young to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It's actually young to be a Supreme Court justice in the first place, quite honestly. Chief Justice John Roberts took over in 2005. He immediately rose to the level of Chief Justice. He was never just a justice. He rose all the way up because of a special circumstance. Back in 2005, when George W. Bush, Bush the younger, if you will, Bush 43 as he's known, who is a Republican, nominated him. He nominated him originally to take the position of a retiring Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first female on the Supreme Court. Sandra Day O'Connor, who was a Reagan appointee, her husband had some health problems, and she realized she was also having some health problems. So she decided that she was going to step aside, and Bush nominated Roberts to take her place. Before he could be confirmed by the Senate, Chief Justice William Rehnquist, also a conservative-leaning justice, died of cancer. And when he died, Bush decided that Roberts would just be elevated automatically directly to becoming the Chief Justice. So John Roberts never served a day as just a regular justice of the Supreme Court. He is now the Chief Justice. Now, he is Harvard educated, both in undergrad and in law school. I want you to kind of pay attention to where these people go to school, because it does kind of matter, especially when you talk about the newer justices on the Supreme Court. Needless to say, it's always kind of been a good old boys club from Ivy League schools like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. It has changed over the course of the years as you add females and as you add different schools of thought about judicial thought and judicial activism, as it's known. So John Roberts is now in charge of the court. Now, you would think because Bush nominated him that he is a conservative, which, he does have conservative tendencies, but he has also been the swing vote on important cases like the one dealing with what is better known as Obamacare, but the Affordable Care Act. The crowning achievement of Barack Obama, and if you read Obama's book, The Promised Land, he makes it very clear that his crown jewel of his 8 years in office is the Affordable Care Act. He's most proud of pushing that through Congress and signing it into law. Well, John Roberts, had he not swung to the liberal justice's side in that court case, Obamacare would have been deemed unconstitutional and would never have been implemented. So John Roberts actually sided with Obama, which was a surprise to many Republicans. And a lot of Republicans felt that he had kind of sold him out a little bit by doing so. So just because you have a tendency towards being conservative doesn't mean you always are conservative. So kind of keep that in mind as you go through this. So John Roberts is the Chief Justice. As I said, he will be the Chief Justice for as long as he chooses to. He's currently 66, which is still very young on the Supreme Court. Not in regular life, but on the Supreme Court, you're a baby comparative to many of the people who are on the court. Now, who is the longest serving of the justices? That is Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas took over as a young man back in 1991. So you're talking that this guy has been there for basically 30 years on the Supreme Court. So he took over when he was in his 40s because he is 72 years old now. He's a graduate of Holy Cross. Holy Cross is a good school, don't get me wrong, but it's not an Ivy League school. So a lot of people kind of raised questions about that. But the reason that he went to Holy Cross is he had issues because of his race getting into Ivy League schools. So he is kind of a claw your way up from the bottom type individual. He eventually went to Yale Law School. He was a nominee of Bush 41, so Daddy Bush, back in 91, and he was the replacement to the very first African-American on the Supreme Court, a man by the name of Thurgood Marshall. So Justice Thomas has been there since 1991, not without controversy, as he was accused very publicly. The very first real public sexual harassment court case involved him, where he was accused by a former legal assistant named Anita Hill of inappropriate jokes and comments and other advances while she was working for his law firm. He survived those allegations and was put on the court, but he has been controversial ever since. He is one of the quietest judges on the Supreme Court, as he truly believes that it is not his role as a judge to ask questions or ask for clarifications, that it's the job of both sides to present their cases, and it's his job to then render a verdict based upon those arguments. So when the court cases are heard in front of the Supreme Court, they're allowed to ask questions. The justices are. And many justices ask tons of questions. The justice who just passed, a woman by the name of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, like I said, just passed away last year. She was very famous for going on long, long tangents of question after question after question. Thomas doesn't question at all. He very rarely says anything. In fact, he's probably coughed on the microphone more than he's ever asked a question in his entire time that he's been in the Supreme Court. So Thomas, not exactly the most vocal of the Supreme Court justices. He is one of the more conservative justices on the Supreme Court. So he has definitely lived up to the expectations of Bush and the Republican Party on that. The Clinton appointee that's still there is the oldest member of the Supreme Court, Justice Stephen Breyer. He's 82 years old, graduate of Stanford, again, a good school on the West Coast, and then went to Harvard for law. And then again, took his office in 1994. This was considered a shift in the Supreme Court because he took over for a Nixon appointee by the name of Harry Blackmun. And in 1994, you're replacing a liberal, since Clinton's a Democrat. You're replacing a conservative, I should say, with a liberal Democrat put in place by Clinton. So there you have it. You have two conservatives. Now your first liberal. Now it's 2-1, if you will. Samuel Alito is the other Bush 43 appointee. He's 70 years old, another conservative voice on the Supreme Court. He has definitely lived up to the expectations of that on the court, as he has kind of been in step with Clarence Thomas being fairly conservative. Went to Princeton, an Ivy League school, and then went to Yale. He was probably at Yale at the same time as Clarence Thomas, in fact. And he was the one that actually took over for Sandra Day O'Connor when she retired. So he's been on the court since 2006. And so far you have a 3-1 shift, or at least lean to the right, conservative leaning so far. That's balanced out by the two Obama appointees. The first one is Sotomayor. Sonia Sotomayor is Latina. She's the first Latina on the Supreme Court. She graduated from Princeton and Yale, so very same pedigree as Alito. She took her seat in 2009 when David Souter retired. And she has kind of a hard upbringing story of her own right. She was raised by a single mother after her father passed away at a very young age. She was raised in the Bronx as a product of immigrants from Puerto Rico. And of course, we don't really call them immigrants, considering, and I know a lot of people in government tend to forget this, but Puerto Rico is part of the United States. So not really an immigrant, just Puerto Rican in heritage, if you will. So needless to say, Sotomayor is the first of the Obama appointees. Obama being a Democrat, you would expect her to be liberal, and so far she has lived up to those expectations. The other is a female by the name of Elena Kagan. The other Obama appointee is a little controversial in her own right because she was never a judge before being a Supreme Court justice. She is 60 years old, graduate of Princeton and Oxford over in England, and of course went to law school at Harvard. Now, she was never a judge, but she was involved in academia. She was the dean of the Harvard Law School. She was a professor. She has many published case notes and articles and journal entries and you name it, whatever else. So she's been widely published and discussed within judicial circles, but that's all been on the academic side. So it was a little controversial that somebody with no experience behind the bench would actually take over. But Obama said that her academic background and her accomplishments outweighed that. The Senate agreed, and in 2010, she took over for a retiring John Paul Stevens, who was a Gerald Ford appointee who was supposed to be conservative, but over the course of his career became more liberal. So he did not live up to the expectations of the conservatives and the Republicans who put him there. So at that point, you'd be 3-3, a tie on the Supreme Court bench of conservatives and liberals. But then you hit the three Trump appointees. Trump had, as we can all agree, a very tumultuous 4 years. But during his 4 years, the reason a lot of conservatives tended to vote for him, even though they didn't like him as a person and they didn't particularly care for him as an individual, as a politician, they didn't like his, certainly didn't like his speeches or didn't like his tone, didn't like his name calling, whatever. But the reason a lot of people voted for him was because he did live up to a campaign promise. One of the campaign promises was that he was going to put conservatives on the Supreme Court, and he has done that. He had 3. This is very rare for a one-term president, especially to have 3. Keep in mind, Bush had 8 years in office, so did Obama, and they only got 2. So Trump has definitely had an impact on the judicial branch, both in the federal courts and in the Supreme Court, by putting a conservative lean towards the court system, if you will. His first appointee was not without controversy, as Justice Neil Gorsuch was put in place in 2017 to replace Antonin Scalia, who was a conservative, probably the most conservative judge on the Supreme Court, who passed away. Now, when Scalia died, you'll notice 2017, that would have been at the same time that the 2016 election was going on. So Obama was still in office when Scalia died. In fact, it was about 7 months until the election and almost a full year before the actual turnover of power to Trump. So Obama actually did nominate somebody, a guy by the name of Merrick Garland, to take over for Scalia. But the Senate, under the control of the Republicans, refused to interview and hold hearings over Garland. So Garland never got his day to actually be interviewed by the Senate. The Senate basically ignored the nomination and said, we're going to let, since it's the last year of your presidency, we're going to let the election decide who the next Supreme Court justice is. Now, is this unconstitutional? There were constitutional scholars arguing it each way. They basically came up with the, well, maybe it is, but it's probably not conclusion. So in the end, when Trump won, Trump came into office and immediately got to nominate a justice. So he nominated Gorsuch. So Garland was ignored. Gorsuch is put on the court, and at 53 is one of the youngest members of the Supreme Court. Went to Columbia, which is an Ivy League education, and has a law degree in both the United States and in England, as Oxford is over in England. So needless to say, he's probably one of the most academic. He's right up there with Kagan being an academic, if you will, and he had been a judge before. So there wasn't too much pushback other than the politics. So is it unconstitutional what happened? No. Is it unethical? Probably. But welcome to politics, because that's kind of what happens, unfortunately. Now, Gorsuch takes office, and then Trump got another one when Anthony Kennedy, who was a moderate, kind of went back and forth. He was the deciding vote in the gay marriage case, decided to retire. And he's replaced by Kavanaugh, who's considered to be fairly conservative. This was not without controversy as well, even though this was a straight up replacement. And he's a graduate of Yale, and he had all the typical, check marks for being a justice. It was controversial because Kavanaugh was accused of basically inappropriate contact with a female during his Yale years. And he basically was being, kind of portrayed as being a party boy and somebody that made horrible decisions in his younger years, which raised the question of, should your past, especially something that happened 30 or 40 years ago, come back to haunt you for a job now? The Senate decided no, and so Kavanaugh was confirmed in 2018. But those whispers about his past have not gone away. So there is controversy surrounding this one as well. The most recent controversy was over our newest member of the Supreme Court, a justice by the name of Amy Coney Barrett. Amy Coney Barrett, only 49 years old, so she is the youngest of the Supreme Court justices. She graduated, and you'll notice, a very different schooling background. She went to Rhodes College. The White House, very famously, the Trump administration, silly in their own right, they said that she was a Rhodes Scholar. A Rhodes Scholar is an English scholarship to an English university. Rhodes College is a small little independent school in Tennessee. So yes, she was a scholar at Rhodes, but not a Rhodes Scholar. Needless to say, she graduated. Now her undergrad is in English literature, so not the typical route for a Supreme Court justice by any means. And then she went to Notre Dame for law school. She didn't go to one of the Ivy League schools. Now Notre Dame is a very good school. It is a highly regarded private school in the United States, obviously, and many of you would know Notre Dame because of their football team. But she went to law school there, and she's the only one that didn't go to an Ivy League law school. Okay, so a lot of people kind of held that up, but she has really been active in academia. She was a professor at Notre Dame. She was a judge for a little while, not very long. And so when Democrats tried to bring that up as being maybe something to stop her from being a judge, the Republicans very correctly said, hey, wait a minute, you said Kagan was fine, and she's never been a judge. So long story short, when she was nominated, she was put into the Supreme Court, but not without controversy. Why? Ruth Bader Ginsburg had died only a few months prior to the 2020 election. So, of course, the Democrats thought, well, since she died right before the election, we'll let the election decide it. The The Republicans in the Senate took a complete 180 from their previous problems back in 2016 and said, no, we're gonna put on Trump's nominee because we control the Senate and we control the White House. So therefore, elections matter. So we're gonna put her on. Which, of course, everybody that argued that we should wait to the election back in 2016 now is arguing the complete opposite. And so there was a lot of hypocrisy on both sides when it came to Amy Coney Barrett. Long story short, she is on the Supreme Court, and she will be until she dies or retires. And again, she's very young. So think about it. If she lives to be 90, you're talking about 40 years of influencing policy on the Supreme Court. So again, that's kind of the big deal. Now, why does that matter? The 3 Trump appointees are all considered to be conservative. The 3 that were already there from previous conservative presidents, all considered to be conservative. So you have a 6-3 lean in the Supreme Court conservative. Now, does that matter? Well, why does the liberal conservative lean matter? Quite honestly, if you look at it, it does and it doesn't. It does from the standpoint that it may take some court cases a direction that the previous courts would not have done. And so, for example, the Warren Court back in 53 through 69, when Earl Warren was the Supreme Court Chief Justice, that tended to be a very liberal court, which is a surprise because Earl Warren was a conservative Republican from California. Dwight Eisenhower put him on, and Eisenhower was a Republican president. Eisenhower always considered that to be one of his biggest blunders, is putting Earl Warren on the Supreme Court, because Earl Warren tended to be rather liberal in his judicial thought. Why? Brown versus the Board of Education got rid of segregation in schools and other public locations. Miranda, Gideon, and Mapp were all decisions that helped out those that are accused of a crime, which was considered to be very liberal in their interpretation of the Constitution. So the Warren Court tended to be very liberal. Now, when Nixon took over and started replacing justices, he replaced Earl Warren with Burger. And when Burger took over, the court became very conservative. Now, it became conservative in some of the court cases that dealt with things like the poor, or dealt with educational philosophy, or even dealt with race relations. But they also had some of the more liberal decisions in Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade is the court case about abortion. And that is widely considered to be one of the most liberal court cases ever put in front of the Supreme Court. And Burger's court was the one that decided it. So it's not completely conservative. It's not, completely far to the right or anything. It just tends to have more right-leaning decisions in court cases. The Rehnquist court, also considered to be conservative, also had some liberal cases as well. They're the court that struck down anti-sodomy laws. They're the ones that struck down a lot of the Planned Parenthood issues around abortion. They're the ones that, decided some court cases that helped out those that are accused of crimes. But again, they do have some conservative leaning court cases as well. And Roberts, considered to be conservative ever since 2005, has led a Supreme Court that has done things like legalize gay marriage, which is not considered to be a conservative way of thinking. Now, they have had some conservative leaning court cases in Citizens United, which dealt with campaign finance, Hobby Lobby, which dealt with reproductive rights and the rights of companies to deny health care to certain individuals. And of course, when it comes to the national FIB versus Sebelius, that's the Obamacare case, which is widely considered to be liberal as well. So we have to keep in mind that even though, yes, some court cases may seem to be very liberal or conservative, the court tends to be a little less political than what most Americans tend to believe. Okay. So needless to say, this all bodes to the question that I asked you on Google Classroom. On Google Classroom, I ask you, is a Supreme Court justice, or should a Supreme Court justice be a lifetime appointee? Should we put this person on for as long as they live, or as long as they want to serve as a Supreme Court justice? Or should we limit it? Should we say, it's going to be 5 or 10 or 15 years, just whatever increment of time that maybe you think would be best for a Supreme Court justice? Because there are a lot of people that have said, hey, we have presidents for 4 or 8 years. We have senators, for 6 years, and we could vote them out theoretically. We have House members for 2-year terms, and we could vote them out theoretically. You can't vote out a Supreme Court justice. Yes, you can bring them up on impeachment charges and try and convict them, but they have to break the law in some way in order to remove them. You have to prove that they are no longer fit to serve on the Supreme Court. So there are a number of people that have kind of raised this, but on the other side, there are people saying, look, this has been the way it's been since the dawn of the American Republic. Since we first signed the Constitution, this is how the Supreme Court is run, and this is what we've done. So kind of think about it both ways. Do you think it's something that we should limit, or do you think, hey, this is how we've always done it, and we should continue it this way? And I would like you to use some of the things that I talked about within the presentation to help support your answer. So again, that's kind of your assignment for the Zoom call. You logging in just in general is going to help you on that grade, by the way. And getting back to grades here, just a reminder for those of you that came in late, we are coming up on the end of the quarter here in about 3 weeks, believe it or not. Early March is when the third quarter is done. And of course, the snow has caused all kinds of problems. We've had, multiple different weekends. We've had all kinds of issues when it comes to that. So do realize that I'm aware that there are going to be problems, but we need to get on it. So if you have issues with any of the grades so far, you need to reach out pretty soon. Okay. Now on the actual assignments, I would remind you that on the Google Classroom, and I'm not going to share my screen because you guys have this on Google Classroom. You can look at it. Under the assignments for 217 through 223, so this week's assignments, I've already got one of you that has posted the answer to the question, which is good. That's fine. Underneath that, you have the weekly assignment checklist that Fickard typically produces for you guys, kind of giving you a rundown of all the things you need to get done. There's an assignment that's 90 points over essential Supreme Court cases. Fickard has put together a Google site for you that goes over some basic cases that the Supreme Court has dealt with, and a lot of cases that deal with federalism, a lot of cases that deal with national policy, if you will. You're just doing a basic overview of those Supreme Court cases. It's a pretty easy assignment, just basic research in how the Supreme Court functions. And then there's another assignment called the federal court system, where Miss J, who is Fickard's student teacher, has put together a short video, very short video, that goes over kind of what the expectations are for the assignment, and a Google slide presentation where you have to answer some questions over the federal courts. Okay, so those two assignments, the Supreme Court cases are 90 points, the federal court system is 50, and of course you have your week 20 review, which one of you has already turned in. I will say this, and I'm going to say this constantly. I am not going to give you the weekly review points unless you do the actual assignments for the week. Okay, there's a reason we label them assignments 1, 2, and 3. So if you're just doing the weekly review every week and just turning it in, that's great that you're doing it, but you do need to A, put on things that you have learned from the unit, B, put on things that you maybe need a little bit of clarification on Zoom meetings, and C, you need to turn it in after you do the actual work for the week. I'm not going to give you moving forward, I'm not going to give you the 25 points until you've done the other assignments first. This should be a culminating activity, not just something you do just to get some quick and easy points. So again, to wrap up, you have the Zoom question that I just asked you. You have the Supreme Court cases, the federal court system, and your week 20 review. And of course, you have, many of you, a whole host of other assignments that you maybe have not gotten around to, that you really need to start getting on here as we start getting back to somewhat of a normal schedule moving forward. I realize you've had some snow days, but quite honestly, those snow days should have been utilized to try and get caught up on some assignments. I realize that some of you had an issue with your Google accounts. We should have that fixed by this point. You should be able to get into your Google Classroom. You should be able to get into your Google email. You should be able to do all of that. So if you still have problems, obviously reach out. And some of you were good enough to email me last night. I didn't get a chance to check it till this morning. But some of you were able to kind of get in contact with me and let me know that there were problems. So I do appreciate that. If you have further questions, you can hang back. I'm going to stop recording at this point.